Welcome to another episode of Russia Unfiltered. Today we're going to be discussing whether Russia is a multicultural marvel. There are many Russian cultures and cultures in Russia, but the title of this episode and the description I just gave you might assume that we mean the 155 indigenous ethnic groups in their respective republics and okrugs. That is but one chapter in a very long story of Russian culture. Indeed, Russian culture isn't monolithic, it is multifaceted. It is built on a cognitive dissonance, selective borrowing from historical errors, different historical errors I should say, and it is also underpinned by both the sense of superiority to other nations and an inferiority complex. For the better part of a century, scholars have argued that Russia is a cultural concept. Russia is an idea rather than a nation. What is the Russian idea, and what culture has it produced, and how does that manifest? Stephen Norris noted that one can think of Russia as either the Izba, the little Russian houses, Tsarist officers, the Siberian forest, Maslenitsa and fairy tales, but you can also see the wet grey streets of St. Petersburg, Khrushchevska flats, the Seven Sisters skyscrapers, sing Soviet songs, and that would still be Russia. Whereas in Russia today, you will see the traditional culture is promoted and intertwined with the modern landscapes. Women in folk dresses carrying bread and teenagers in ripped jeans on their iPhones can stand alongside each other both in Moscow City and in Suzdal Spaso Yefimiev, can never pronounce that word right, monastery. In film, Soviet classics dominate TV airwaves still, but ask most Russians what they prefer watching and it's usually 3-hour-long YouTube videos featuring interviews or flat renovations. Even my local pharmacy, Zhivika, has a Russian woman in the traditional dress as its mascot, but the old folk remedies are no longer sold. This is something Ilya Kalinin called nostalgic modernization. At the state level, the Kremlin is also interested in promoting both European Slavic culture as well as the different cultures of the motherland. There are 4 official state religions. They call them the religions of the motherland, those that are inherited, not, imported. And these are weaved into a wider Russian cultural identity. It is one that promotes state loyalty, Russia's uniqueness, and a social cohesion. More recently, in fact just this week of recording, Putin signed into law 2 new public holidays, the Day of Languages of the People of Russia and the Day of Indigenous Minority Peoples of Russia. The idea is that being Russian and being a Russian citizen can be flexible, as long as it fits within certain cultural confines. So in this episode, we want to discuss what are Russian cultural confines, how are they used, how does that manifest both naturally and in a forced way, and how does the kind of traditional culture intertwine with modernity and cherry-pick, the Soviet and the ethnic minority cultures. Finally, is there a cohesive cultural identity in modern Russia, and what does it mean to be a part of Russian culture? Thank you for bearing with me in that long introduction. I'm James Pearce.
Jeremy Morris.
And I'm Jonny Tickle.
Just to kick us off, I'll explain to our viewers what the Russian idea is. So it's runs along 3 lines. First, is Russia Europe, Asia, or neither? Second, is Russia a democracy, autocracy, or technocracy? Okay, and then finally, it has to do with this notion of, ideology or values and principles. So you had communism, or is there a religious thing, or is there something else that binds them together? So that's what the Russian idea is. Who wants to kick us off? So, Russian culture.
On the Russian idea, I think quite a lot of people that are just generally interested in Russia, regardless of their background, might well have come across this concept. And it has been a concept that has been quite prominent in intellectual life in Russia for probably 200 or more years. And it has had kind of an outsized influence on how Russians, intellectual Russians, whatever, have thought about themselves, because it brings to the forefront what you mentioned, James, this triple problematic of identity, like civilizational location between in a kind of space that's on the edge of Europe a history of having a form of governance that is both arbitrary, autocratic, and, as you said earlier, state-centric, right? And it's important to differentiate between state centricity and autocratic rule, because they're actually different things. And then, as you said, values orientations. And it's kind of like maybe the third one, values orientations, that allows people to think about cultural differences. But right from the outset, what I would say is I've moved from a position where I was trained in that tradition of cultural difference and looking at literature and art and music as an expression of cultural difference, to having a much more culturally relativist position, because I retrained as an anthropologist, and anthropologists still can't agree what we mean by culture. But that's just my kind of preamble. And sure, we can talk about these things, but we're often talking about kind of very different things that mean, and even simple words, we understand what we mean by English culture or French culture. They can mean completely different and really strongly contested.
Just on that,
things.
because we often, when I say we, I mean scholars and experts, this idea, Russia is different. You talked about the civilizational aspect, and there is a civilizational aspect in Russian foreign policy documents and in the educational documents. But one of my personal bugbears is everyone says, "Oh, Russia's different." It's like, well, different to what? Yeah. In what way is it different? I mean, I would argue Norway and Portugal are not exactly similar, but we still consider them Western cultures, right? So, whereas Russian culture, it's like, well, is it different to both Norway and, well, it is, but different how? And I think it's different in that you've got all these different layers of Russianness going on here that are quite unique to its circumstances, both where the country is and how it's developed.
I'm sure we'll bring that in, the historical determining, how much history and geography determine and apparent differences. But maybe we should turn it over to Jonny now.
Yeah, John.
Well, you spoke about the Russian idea, and it's the sort of belief that Russia has this unique civilizational path, which is shaped by scale and contradiction and the constant push and pull between Europe and Asia. It seems like a sort of historical project that contains many Russias at once, and not as a single identity or a single culture, but a layered mix. And that sort of brings me on to the topic of multiculturalism, because we often compare multiculturalism in the way we think about it in the West. I mean, as Western people, when we're looking onto Russia. But Russia is not multicultural in the Western sense. Russia is multicultural in structure, but I would say here cultures coexist, but they're certainly not equal in public visibility. The Slavic Center has the loudest microphone, so life outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg is very different in that way. Russia loves symbolic diversity, whether that's folk costumes, dances, national republics with their flags, but the deeper stuff, the real multicultural stuff like language rights or political autonomy, representation is far more limited. So the way we see multiculturalism in the Western sense is quite different to the Russian sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pick up on a couple of things both of you said here, Jeremy, culture and power in Russia have always been very much closely intertwined. And one of the main splits in Russian society and in the culture is, those who think that link is too strong and those who think it's perhaps not strong enough. That, whether it's the church and the state or the ideology of the Communist Party and the Soviet state. Russia it has a European state. Its origins are European, the Slavic culture that affected the state, and but it had an Asian empire. Okay, and it incorporated, sometimes by force, sometimes naturally, and there was a lot again. Now, many of our viewers might not know this, but Moscow, the first settlers around Moscow were not Slavs, they were Finns, all the way up to the upper Volga and down. And you had peoples from the steppes coming over and Scandinavian traders coming down the rivers and things. So Russia, yeah, as Johnny said, Russia has always been different cultures that have coexisted. The Slavic culture came to dominate for various reasons, which I don't think we have time to go into, unfortunately, in this podcast. But there has always, again, been, again, if we think about Russian culture, Johnny said, the folk is good. Doesn't matter if it's Yakut or, I don't know, Ingush folk. It's always something that's worth promoting because it's this idea not just of uniqueness, but of kind of ancientness and enduringness. Yeah, Russia endures, I would say. Go on, Jeremy.
So you mentioned the folk. So that's I mean, obviously, narod, folk, the people, kind of could be translated in different ways, and obviously has its own. The fact that that word narod has its own strong connotations in Russian reveals that it's been deployed as a really important trope in defining aspects of Russianness, right? So that's good. Again, that's a good example, I think. But it's interesting, again, that you say that, and obviously you're right, that the idea of a pure, authentic narod is always projected as a pinnacle of the good Russian, right? And the goodness of Russia is itself, of course, very revealing, because it's just another example of how that aspect of culture is obviously an imagined and invented one, right? Because again, it's always intellectuals sitting in Moscow, many of whom had French as their first language, right? Or if we bring it forward to the 20th century, had become highly urbanized, were perhaps of Jewish origin, or indeed Western European origin in reality. They're the ones writing these books about the authentic Russia and the authentic Russians that are out there in the backwater. Again, they're not in Moscow. They're not Jews. They're not educated people, right? So again, it's a projection that's very, very distant from the people that are doing that projection. So again, we should acknowledge this kind of commonplace, really, of people that talk about culture and national identity, that we're very much talking about imagined communities popularized by
Imagined Communities.
Anderson.
That's a nice book that if you're a student, you should be reading that. The Imagined Communities, yeah.
And so Russia, in this sense, Russia's no different from any other European country.
Well, that's
in
the
that
point I was
it is
making,
riddled with contradictory projections of what is authentic and what is not authentic. And of course, that has nothing to do with concrete reality. It's a part of developing national identity and nationalism by defining, quite often in weird and arbitrary ways, how we are different from the Germans. As we are different from the Jews, we are different from the Germans, we're different from the Tatars, but maybe not so different. We're different from the Chinese, and we're definitely different from those English and Americans, right? And often, as I said, the irony is, of course, it is people that are just a few generations from the Central European shuttle, or indeed from German immigration to the Volga region. It's these people, or the children of these people, that are doing that defining, which is we shouldn't forget. Johnny.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way a lot of people talk about Russian culture, maybe in the academic sense. But Russian culture today is very much a state-sponsored thing. There's the culture that the state likes to showcase, which is Slavic, Orthodox, like Victory Day kind of aesthetics. And then there's the culture that people actually consume, like you said, which is like YouTube or rap music. And of course, these overlap in some places, but they're not the same. Like Orthodox icons and Cossack dances and folk imagery, it exists, but a lot of the time it's just a symbolic thing. Like
And
the
that's it.
state
Russia is
likes
a
the
country that's
state,
big on
yeah. The state likes to talk about unity, or either through Slavic identity or the harmony of ethnic republics. But in reality, the strongest unifying force in Russia today is they all watch the same YouTube channels. Like a Yakut, a teen from Yakutia and a Muscovite office worker, they listen to the same podcasts and they watch the same comedy shows. Because one thing we can say about this sort of traditional imagery, that Russians are definitely not revolting against it. It's not that they dislike it. It's just ignored most of the time. It's sort of like wallpaper. Like young Russians do attend maybe the Orthodox Easter celebrations, but their cultural life is hip hop or YouTube channels or podcasts or, I mean, TikTok that's basically parroting American Gen Z slang. It's like there's a bit of a contrast here between state-sponsored culture, which people don't reject, and then the actual real culture, which is more of an active culture rather than a passive culture.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I mean, I think we all know people, and maybe many of our viewers and listeners do. We all know people. You go into their flat, they've got the icons up in the corner. You know, they've probably got some Soviet memorabilia. Some of the Soviet history and holidays probably give them a lot of meaning in life, and they probably very much enjoy them. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. And, you know, even in the Soviet Union, people still had religious icons in their flats. It never went away, but it didn't stop them from participating in Soviet life as it was. Same with Maslenitsa. Now, I mean, that kind of came out as a folk tradition. Pancake Week, we should say. Maslenitsa is... They have a week in Russia, not just a day, which I am fully supportive of. And then they burn the effigy. But again, that became intertwined with Christian traditions. So you've got... Yeah, but again, I think, you know, Russians, they just want to go and have pancakes. They're not really thinking, oh, you know, the Eastern Slavs and the pagans. But yes, you're right. They're not thinking of that. But they accept very passively this state-promoted culture. And I mean, I think, let's be honest, it's nice sometimes to see these things, you know, like, oh, you know, these historical reminders of where you've come from. I was going to say one more thing there. It just slipped my mind, but it kind of, what was it to do with? Maybe I'll remember in a minute. Go on, Jeremy.
Okay. So some interesting things both of you said that maybe we can pick up on a bit more. So Johnny emphasized, and you, James, you emphasized the visibility of state-sponsored folkloristic culture, right? And what I would emphasize is that this shows two things. One, the complete lack of imagination and fear of genuine kind of uncontrolled cultural expression that the state historically has. And indeed, some observers of this kind of culture have called it fake law, right?
Fake law.
Again, a very recent invented tradition that actually masks the way that the Soviet period, not necessarily actively, but as a result of its extremely rapid and brutal modernization, completely erased the peasant way of life and erased the differences between regions in Russia. So very often this is a kind of fake law rather than folklore. And as you both said, it's very prominent. It was very prominent in the Soviet period. I remember going on holiday to Sochi a long time ago and being told, well, okay, you have to go on this tour. And it's, yes, it was Cossacks singing and dancing, and they'd all been imported from Moscow, and, you know, half of them were Tatars and half of them were Jewish performers that had gone to a theatre school. So a great example of fake law in action, even in the 90s. And again, it was this very Soviet phenomenon that everybody had to be part of a safe, sanitized, imagined version of the present past, because that made it, indeed, safe and distant and completely depoliticized. And the other thing is that the visibility of that in state-sponsored cultural production kind of also indicates the massive vacuum at the heart of Russian culture. When we talk about, what does it mean to be Russian? What is it in your everyday life? What are your values? Again, I'm not saying that in a negative way, that it's a vacuum. It's again that the fact that the state sucked all the value out of society for so long, that the visible aspects tend to be this kind of fake recuperation of something that never even
if I may
existed.
just jump
That's
in on
not to say, just to finish, that's not to say that you actually, James pointed out, if we're going to use culture with a small c, which is generally what we're saying here, and not culture as a meaning system of societies, but culture as in the vernacular sense, right? So like art, music, fashion, culture with a little c, which is what we anthropologists call it. You actually picked up on a really nice point, which is that the one thing that would unite Russians is making and eating pancakes. But it isn't just during Maslenitsa, it's the whole year round.
All year round, yeah. I mean, on that, before I hand over to Jonny, because, we're all English. We're from the UK, but we're from England more specifically. And I mean, if you think about British culture, or indeed English culture, throughout the last 1,000 years, it's been very good at absorbing external things. Russia has absorbed these other cultures as well, but it's also co-opted them in ways that perhaps wasn't the case in England and in the British Isles. So, for instance, we didn't really co-opt much Scottish and Welsh things into the wider British. It's still very much an English identity. And on that, I mean, because I mentioned in my intro about the kind of the new holidays for indigenous peoples and the languages. One of them is on the same day as the birthday as Rasul Gamzatov, who wrote the famous poem The Cranes. Fortunately, I don't think we've got time to get into that, but just have a look it up. But again, it's the state co-opting a Soviet non-Slavic writer who saw himself as both Russian and Soviet, and forget what was his ethnicity again.
I worked with this guy a long time ago. Yeah. Okay, go on. Carry on.
We're in trouble there. Yeah. But again, it's co-opting and it's absorbing it, but again, it still has to be within that hierarchy. And I suppose a good direction to take this in, and we'll start with Jonny, is what is the cohesion now? John mentioned podcasts. What else is the unifying force among the different cultures of Russian culture?
Well, before I do that, he was from Dagestan, and the reason I know that is because in Makhachkala, there's a statue of him on the main street.
Of course, there is. Yeah,
I'm sure. Actually, a lot of Russians will know that, because Dagestan became a very, very popular tourist destination since COVID and since the war. It's full of Slavic, Muscovites, really. So, if we're talking about, maybe I can talk about this in sort of layers of Russian identity. I don't know if this is something that people do in academia, but I'm going to do it now anyway. So there's the folk layer, or we can even call it fake law. And then on top of that, we have the Soviet stuff, which still exists. Russia's one of the very few countries where teenagers will be able to quote Soviet comedies. And it's like, this Soviet past isn't just history, it's like an active part of the cultural operating system today. And then on top of that, we have modern Russian culture. But what we also have, and something you do notice if you spend time in other parts of Russia and you speak to people who are not Slavic, say from Yakutia or Chechnya, their sense of identity is very, very local. They participate in the Russian state, but they do not necessarily imagine themselves as branches of a Russian cultural civilization. It's even if we look at Soviet nostalgia here as part of the Russian culture, Soviet nostalgia is strong, but it's not universal. If you go to Dagestan, Tatarstan, Yakutia, far north, they have their own cultural foundations, which are deeper than Soviet identity. Yes, they do have some of those Soviet things, of course, they can't avoid that, but their own local identity is a lot deeper. So I think we should really point out that these things like local languages, clan structures, Islam, folklore, community life has shaped lots of people more than Soviet films and Soviet school books, and more than Russia has so far. I mean, Russia's quite a young country in that way, I suppose. But these layers, yeah, Russian Federation. That's what I mean. These layers are all make up part of identity today. So that's why it's a complicated topic to talk about. And I guess that's why it's interesting in a way that English culture isn't.
Jeremy?
I mean, I want to go back to some points that you made. Like James, absorption and co-option of aspects of other cultures. I mean, that's, I think, quite useful to think about Russia, because it also reflects the contiguous empire, right? So we talk about the way Britishness absorbed elements of its empire, but as you said, it's different from the way that Russia absorbed tropes, elements of its empire, because of the very strong assimilating power of Russia, for good and for ill, of course, right? But that's, I think, something worth emphasizing. Again, if we're going to do the most dangerous thing possible, which is to say that we could define culture with a large C, right? Culture as like a system of learned patterns and behaviors, ideas, that kind of thing. So assimilative power, I think that you touched on, is quite important in a way that's different from some Western European or Northern European cultures. And then you also touched on, with the small c, culture as holidays, again indicating perhaps the weak purchase that Jonny was talking about, really, of the last 100 years or so, the weak purchase of the Soviet system, in that, yes, people identify, as you said, James, with holidays and the idea of shared holidays. We must all, on this enormous space, celebrate International Women's Day, which again is not even a Russian holiday, right? In the same way, this indicates that there's quite a strong degree of ritual behind Russian culture with a small c, which, as Jonny indicates, actually has quite weak purchase beyond this. You know, if you ask people to reflect on why on the 8th of March every man has to bring home an odd number of flowers to his significant other.
Why is it an odd number?
Is it an odd number?
It's a bad number.
It's even numbers are for funerals.
Yeah.
Even numbers for funerals, right? Again, ritual, meaningless ritual. So again, culture with a small c is a lot of times about meaningless rituals. And I think what Jonny's getting to actually is again a positive thing. I don't want to kind of give the impression that I'm shitting on any of this stuff. But you know, what Jonny's saying is actually a great thing about Russia is the plasticity of people and their preferences and values. Again, the stereotype is that, you know, Russians have always remained a risk-averse, socially conservative group that is easily manipulated into deferring to authority as a way of solving the problem of insecurity, right? And again, that ridiculous, frankly, generalization is repeated in the most cutting-edge, respected political science that is published today in American social science journals,
Yeah.
and then that's filtered down into the way that the global hegemon, the United States of America, interacts with Putin and Russia, right?
And then you
but
get
what Jonny's saying,
stereotypes, yeah.
what Jonny's saying is actually the opposite. That whether it's because of history or not, Russians are hugely absorptive, assimilative in a positive way. In that, yeah, I've met people. For example, I've met recently somebody that came from a background in the sticks, whose parents did not have a university education, and he is addicted to Joseph Haydn, the composer. Right? What a weird thing. But that's a very Russian thing, to be completely focused on something outside your own cultural context, but be super, super, super interested in it, almost to a kind of almost autistic degree.
Yeah.
And so that's my take on what Jonny says, which I think is actually really positive. That you're much more likely to meet somebody that's hugely into 1980s hip hop, as you are likely to meet somebody that really is strongly identifying with what we sometimes wrongly say is this massively influential cultural thing, which is like Soviet films, which, as you say, James, people can quote, but increasingly it's less relevant, isn't it?
Exactly.
As you said,
and I
Jonny.
mean, I've had students and colleagues who are like, "Oh, I like Irish literature," and I'm like, "Do you?" It's like, well, it's like, oh,
And
what
they
do you
probably
think
do.
Yeah, and they probably do. It's like, what do you think? I'm like, I don't know. But that's it. I mean, and I think that's what, going back to a previous video, what a lot of experts miss. Just on things, though, that I think some of our viewers might, if we go a bit deeper into the kind of Russian psychology and national cultural psychology, Russians are desperate to feel good about their country. They have been, I would say, since the collapse of communism. Now, sometimes that can manifest into dangerous nationalism, or it can manifest into, well, there are so many things, as Jonny said, there's different layers of identity, and this Russian idea that they all buy into it is a cherry picking. So a person from Dagestan in Russia, they're Dagestani. They are Muslim. They might even be called black or some other derogative terms, which we're not going to mention here. But, they go abroad and then they're Russians because they have a Russian passport. A person from Dagestan might be welcomed differently in Turkey because, again, there might be some shared culture and other history going on there. So again, this feel-good aspect, I mean, what I've noticed just living in Russia and in my research as well is there's always something. It's like, do you remember these cakes people made thousands of years ago? Forest. They made a slight comeback in recent years. Or, certain writers made a comeback. With the religion, again, now, I mentioned in my intro, there's 4 officially recognised religions. Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. So that's the inherited, and they're studied at school. And there has been a slight religious resurgence, but there's also been a resurgence in the pagan and the kind of folk things. And if I just to the layers of identity, you may be familiar with Otikan, the band from Siberia. Now, a couple of years ago, they broke onto this. They sing in the native languages of, the certain Siberian ethnic republics. Some are similar to Mongol and Kyrgyz or Turkic languages. But again, they were popular worldwide before they were popular in Russia because the way the songs and the way they were dressed, and then seeing that, the Russian state, there was suddenly an RT documentary on that, and there were, just on that, I mean, I'll pass over, I realise I'm just ranting now, but go on, John. The feel good.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there about the state promoting a sort of feel-good culture from non-Slavic cultures. And I think, yeah, the state does showcase different cultures, but it's very curated. Like the state chooses what counts as acceptable cultural expression. It's not an organic diversity, it's a managed diversity. Some traditions are promoted because they fit the national story, while others like barely appear. So cultures that get promoted are the ones that can fit into this. They can be easily folded into this Russian idea of a loyal, unified country. But anything that hints at political claims or strong regional identity, alternative histories, is softened or ignored, or people get arrested for that kind of thing. So I think we have to say here that this sort of celebration of local cultures, it's not the same as them having their own cultural autonomy. Because celebrating these like colourful bits, the dancing around is really, really easy, but allowing genuine autonomy in how a culture is represented is much harder. So I think we shouldn't say that this like sort of promotion of local cultures is the same as giving them agency.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy?
Well, and indeed, going back to Gamzatov, the fact that we're calling him Dagestani is also like a bit problematic, because obviously there's no such thing as Dagestanis. I mean, it's the most ethnically diverse, one of the most ethnically diverse regions of the world, and he himself is now I've remembered. He himself is kind of representative of this acceptable face of sanitized ethnic difference. In the Soviet period and in the post-Soviet period. So we talked about a lot of the problems with culture with a small c. Art, music, fashion, how it's changed a lot. I think what you said, Johnny, is really important, and it's incredibly cosmopolitan. If anything, again, I would like to go back to that and say, I'm just so struck with what you said, that, yeah, actually, maybe what makes Russian culture interesting is that in some respects it's much more cosmopolitan than English culture, than your average young British people, right? So young Russian people are much more likely to be listening to like hugely omnivorous and multi-linguistic tastes, right?
It's all K-pop now.
It's all K-pop, is it?
Yeah.
I thought K-pop was very 2010s. Are we not beyond K-pop?
Well, no, it's it's big. It's huge now. It's definitely not 2010s. It's lasted 2 or 3 years. When I first moved to Russia 8 years ago, everyone was obsessed with English culture because that was the period of Ed Sheeran and Sherlock on the BBC. And now all the kids today, all the teenagers listen to K-pop and watch anime, whatever it's called, from Korea, and that's the big cultural monolith now for young people, especially teenagers. I don't know about younger than that. It's K-pop.
And old people actually. So when I go and stay with my interlocutor, as they say in the jargon, when I go and stay with my elderly couple who are at the centre of my kind of network of people in my research, and they're in their late 60s now. Yeah, I have to basically sit down with I can't think of the pseudonym, but with the wife in the family, and she's in her late 60s, as I said, and we have to watch South Korean soap operas. Yes, like for hours and hours at a time. So it's not just young people.
Yeah. Well, Russian TV now is full, like First Channel, so it's on Russian state TV, is full of Turkish soap operas.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, they're very big. I mean, just on that as well, because one thing I think that sort of we're dancing around, and we'll be careful how, there is also a culture of victory in the Russian culture, and this culture of triumph. I mentioned in my introductory monologue, Russian culture, there is a sense of, we are morally superior to other nations. Now, the English have that as well, but what I suppose is different from the sort of English Protestant, we are moral, and the Russian Orthodox superiority, if you want, is, one of it's kind of based on we are morally superior because we are part of the right religion, and but also because if you read Russian history and Russian literature, it's always this idea of triumphs overcoming embarrassing defeats. So the defeat of the Mongols was overcome by, World War One was the bourgeois war, and then communism defeated and then we overcame communism and dictatorship and then Putin, he overcame the chaos of. So there is that, and obviously the Second World War. So there is that victory culture. We are the best. We feel we're the best, if you like. But there's also, because it's that inferiority thing. Again, going deep into the Russian psyche, there is a part of, I would say, a lot of Russians that they look at the West, and yes, they admire the West, and they are not stupid. They see, okay, they live better than we do. That certain things are better than what we have. But they also look at the West and they say, oh, you want us to fail. Secretly, you want us to fail. And you'd like us to... And that still... I think that is why they accept, as Jonny said, the state promotion of certain cultural hegemons and so on. I mean, what do we think about...
Well, Russia has a cultural confidence problem where it simultaneously believes it's special while believing it's behind. It's something I'm sure we've all experienced as Westerners here. I'm sure we've mentioned it on a previous podcast, where the people will say that Russia's better than the West, whatever, but they'll meet you and you're suddenly some sort of celebrity because you come from the West. It's like this sort of contradiction they have about thinking that they're special, thinking that Russia deserves the world and everything, but at the same time that it's far behind, that other cultures are moving past them. Or I guess nowadays it's the other cultures in the 90s were really far ahead, and Russia's trying to catch up now. There's this sort of contradiction in the minds of a lot of people I meet.
Yeah, I think that sums it up well. The experience that one has as a Westerner really reveals what is a fundamental contradiction in the way that Russians think about themselves. Once again, I'm not saying that there's any objectivity or
explaining
we
a situation to our viewers.
Pin this down.
Yes.
But this kind of bravura, this overconfidence, which you encapsulated, James, in the obsession with victory, the obsession with beating others, right? Which can actually then segue into extremely destructive and unpleasant way of relating to the rest of the world, actually hides what Jonny highlighted, and that is fundamentally a sense of an inferiority, a cultural inferiority complex. And this is very obvious, as Jonny says, if you interact with people over any period of time.
I mean, I've asked... Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I've asked, I've had lots of kind of pointless, drunk conversations with people. It's like, well, if Russia's the best country,
why do you do this to yourself, James?
So this notion of envy, it's like, how many people envy Russia from the West? We've done podcasts on people moving to Russia, but it's like, lots of Russians envy the West. From the other side, you don't get a lot of that. It's like, why don't they envy us if we are special? And now, I mean, that roots I was thinking of, and I lost it in my brain. It comes from the Orthodox Church, this idea of a special mission, civilizing mission, but also this idea of we are the God-carrying people. The Third Rome, which, I mean, we're not going to come to, and then communism gave it another kind of thing. But yeah, that inferiority, I mean, if we talk about sports, England could lose to Brazil because they're the champions. But if they lost to Nigeria, it doesn't matter if they're above in the world rankings. oh, that would be a disaster. Could we lose to England? Well, yeah, we could lose to England. I mean, am I right in that assertion, John?
I don't know. I think if we look back at 2018 when the World Cup was here, I don't know if you remember the celebrations on the streets when they beat Spain
Yeah.
it was unbelievable. But I don't know if that's a Russian thing.
It was a
I'm
pride
not sure if I
thing.
agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with you that this is like a uniquely Russian thing. It's just like you beat a team that's better than you.
Yeah, but it's like there are foreigners they look down on, Africans,
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
parts of Asia, probably Latin America, but Brazil are the champion. We can lose to Brazil. That's okay. Couldn't lose to Iran. They played Iran not long ago. But it would be a disaster, I think. Go on,
Yeah,
Jeremy.
maybe you're right.
I don't know anything about football. Thank goodness I don't know anything about football. So I can't join in this part of the discussion. But to go back to what you said about inferiority complex, fundamentally, once again, it's not necessarily reflected in reality, in the fact that Russians have more or fewer cultural, scientific achievements than other European countries, which is, of course, absurd to try and compare it in that way. But certainly it is, again, a cultural trope for Russian intellectuals about their own country that then diffuses through the whole of society and then gets expressed in different ways. Like we've said, all of us have experienced that. The kind of blagging, the idea of vranyo, that is like pulling people's legs about how we, the Russians, are better than you lot in this way, which then masks a fundamental lack of confidence, then reveals itself in the same conversation with ridiculous projections of how much better life is in the imagined West, right? So we've all experienced that. But that goes back once again to what you started with, James, which is the historical trajectory of this state that happens to lie on the borders of Europe and Asia and Northern Asia. And that is an acknowledgement that again and again and again, societies in Russia have reverted to forms of autocratic government, highly centralized state that is not very good at doing its fundamental job. And so then the fact that Russians think of themselves, historically have thought of themselves as part of Europe, but on the edge of Europe, feeds in. That's why it feeds in to this story. And that's all it is, of belatedness, backwardness, and fundamental inferiority in the face of the secularized, industrialized, and quote unquote technologically superior West, right? So again, it's a fundamentally important story that Russians tell themselves, right? That then has an effect in the real world, right? It's not that it's necessarily true, but it just has, and it has this really pernicious effect in that Russians are always trying to justify how in reality they are better, and how in reality it was they who invented the radio, and it was they who invented jet engines, and it was they that invented all these things. This kind of overcompensatory mechanism kicks in, which is just incredibly tiresome.
Do you have anything to add to that, John, before I have one more provocative question to wrap up after?
I mean, no, not really. I think Jeremy summarized it well. But I think, I mean, this is not a topic for this podcast, really, but I'll just touch on it quickly. The way foreign people talk about Russian culture is often, I feel like, is somewhat reflective of this too. It's like, especially when at points in time when Russia is the enemy. So we see that today, and I'm sure it happened during the Cold War. People will talk about Russia as Asian, as a prerogative, or backwards. That's obviously shockingly racist to say that you're backwards, so you're Asian. But in reality, what that actually does is it chimes with Russian people's own insecurities about being European or not. And I mean, my personal judgment is that, of course, Russia's European. The language is European. It's mainly Christian, which is European. The royal family was married into the other European royal families, almost in every possible way. At least the state is European.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, there was the European Russia, and then a lot of the population were, and still do, participate in a very un-European culture. And I think that's one thing we can get across to our viewers, is like there is a, European-esque and very un-European-like behaviour. Now, I just wanted to end on one final provocative question, because we participate in Russian multiculture, because that's what we're talking about. We participate in the many cultures, and I suppose one more would be cultural stereotypes. I mean, are they Russian part of that multiculture? The stereotypes of, playing the balalaika, drinking vodka, dancing. I mean, I like vodka, I like the banya. Yeah, but go on. And we like Russia, we should say. That's why we do the podcast. Go on.
Well, like stereotypes are part of the part and parcel of the small C of culture, right? And I don't know. Having lived in 4 different countries for a significant period of time, the more I experience quote unquote different cultures, the more I come to associate particular stereotypes about particular cultures more with other cultures. So stereotypes about Russians sometimes I think are more true of Americans. Stereotypes about British people I find to be more true about Danish people quite often. So I think everybody loves to employ stereotypes, but generally they tell us much more about the people that are deploying them than the cultures that they're supposedly telling us something about.
Go on, John.
And that, and that just to finish, because we talked about values and civilizational values as well. I just want to emphasize about how we could dismiss people that deploy stereotypes about Russia, right? But this is perniciously influences indirectly even so-called objective science, right? In that whenever I give a talk about Russia, there's somebody in the audience, usually an academic from the United States, that says, oh, well, what about the World Values Survey? And what about Ronald Inglehart and Christian Welzel and their plotting of world values, and the fact that Russia is both highly secular but also socially conservative? And I'm just like, oh my goodness, how isn't this pretty similar to the way that lay people deploy cultural stereotypes?
John?
Yeah, I think as we're sort of wrapping up here, I'd like to talk about Russian culture today and how it's being influenced today by the internet. Because people talk about Orthodox revival, folk culture, old Russia, and traditional culture is important, but I think if we're honest, the thing shaping behavior and worldview today is the internet. YouTube, Telegram, memes, rap music, the online world, this sort of omni-culture that we all live in, no matter where you live in the world, influences Russian people far more now than folklore or church holidays. And I think once YouTube replaced TV, for many, many people, the cultural centre of gravity just moved. The TV has structure and gatekeepers, which YouTube doesn't. Well, it does, but different types, I suppose. And now cultural influence comes from vloggers and comedians and analysts and reaction channels. They define the human attitudes and even the political instincts in a way that an Orthodox revival never did. Folk culture never has. So I think if we sort of bring this discussion to sort of looking forward, what's the future of Russian culture and multiculturalism in Russia, I would say we have to look to the internet to decide that, because it isn't going to come from the government, and it's not going to come from state-sanctioned holidays. It's going to come probably from America or the West, and the stuff that's imported. I mean, just to go on a little tangent quickly, 2 weeks ago was Halloween. Halloween was, when I first moved to Russia, it wasn't that long ago, it's less than a decade ago, Halloween was far smaller than it is now. And now, this year, this October, every shop had Halloween decorations and kids were outside having parties, dressed up. So that's not come from the government, that's not come from the state. The Orthodox Church actually condemns it, but they can't do anything about it because they don't control culture. The state doesn't control the culture. Internet controls the culture, which means that American culture is winning.
Yeah, and I think we have to, when we look back, we'll see that there was a nation of people on their phones after 2022, and we were talking about a nation that we thought was glued and its attention was elsewhere. That's my historian's brain there anyway. But yes, people are very much in the virtual world. They're and Russian memes, fantastic, very witty. We have to give them their dues there. Like, I would argue even wittier and sometimes more clever than that comes out of Western countries. Jeremy, do you want a final word quickly?
Not really.
That's okay.
Russian memes. Okay, we can end on the note that Russian memes sometimes lost in translation, but they do unite the internet.
Yes, and that might be the new Russian idea, is the idea of the... Yeah. Cool. All right, let's leave it there. Thank you for watching, everybody.